Single dads, what happens when you introduce your girlfriend to your daughter? As I pulled into my driveway, two police officers cornered me and said, "Your foster daughter was caught stealing $500. This was the girl who insisted on spending all her allowance on Christmas presents for kids in her group home. I handed them $800 as an apology and immediately went inside to talk to Aria. The moment our eyes met, she broke down crying. I'm sorry. I'll pay it back," she sobbed, her whole body shaking. "Pay it back with what money? Why do you need—" She suddenly bolted mid-sentence, running to the bathroom and locking the door behind her. That's when I saw it. Smoke coming from under the door accompanied by the smell of artificial watermelon, a vape. She used to scrunch her nose when we walked past people smoking. "Aria, please open the door. We need to talk about this." No response. Just the sound of her crying getting quieter, like she was trying to muffle it. That's when Veronica, my girlfriend of 8 months, touched my shoulder. "Let me," she said, her voice softer than usual. Sometimes girls need another woman to talk to. Veronica slipped inside with her favorite brand of ramen noodles and Monster, and I heard the lock click again. An hour later, Aria walked out with Veronica's arm around her shoulders. She was smiling, but something about it made my skin crawl. "Everything's fine, Dad," she said, her voice oddly bright. "Just teenage stuff. I'm gonna go to bed now." Veronica patted my arm. "She'll be okay. Just need some space." I was fast asleep at 2 a.m. when I heard the sound of the front door creaking open. I waited until I heard the front door close before following her. When I got outside, I caught sight of Aria climbing into a black van I didn't recognize. My heart was pounding as I fumbled for my keys and followed them onto the highway. From the back, I could tell it was a bald man with a white beard and cigarette fingers. We drove for 20 minutes before they pulled into a truck stop, the one known for being a trafficking hotspot. Through the van window, I could make out the face of a man who looked about 40 years old, leaning toward my daughter. Before I could figure out what was going on, he tilted a water bottle to Aria's lips. She drank it like a baby, while his hand was reaching for her face, and tears filled her eyes. My stomach lurched when I saw how she wasn't pulling away, just sitting there like a doll, her movements slow like she was on something. When I finally filmed enough to have him locked up, I let the rage fuel my body. I didn't think. I just ran, yanked open the van door and pulled the man out so hard I heard fabric tear. Stuff was falling out of the van's side door, and that's when I saw it. Every compartment was filled to the brim with rope and zip ties. On the floor was an open bottle of white pills. My vision went red. Aria jumped on my back, her voice slurred and barely coherent. "Dad, leave him alone." Veronica tied I had to do this. The man scrambled away, dropping something as he ran. I picked it up and saw it was Aria's passport. I held my daughter's semi-conscious body on the cold pavement while her body shook with tears. "Dad, I thought this is what you wanted," she whispered, and I felt my whole world tilt. "Veronica has videos of me. She said no one would want me if they saw them, that you'd be disappointed." "Baby, what are you talking about?" She said she was helping me with modeling photos. Aria's voice was getting clearer, but the words were worse. But then she kept taking more, ones I didn't want. While I was changing, in the shower, I'm naked in all of them. She said if anyone saw them, they'd think I was dirty, that you'd send me back to foster care because you couldn't have a daughter like that living with your new girlfriend. I was just trying to find a new man to take care of me when I turn 18, since I'm just your foster kid, not your real daughter. I lunged at her for a hug, but she held me back. Her hands traveled to her stomach as her lip quivered with sadness. "Dad, there's one more thing I did. Veronica said it would make me more valuable, that men pay more for pregnant girls." My entire body went cold. "Was the man in the car one of your clients?" I pulled my phone from my pocket with shaking hands, keeping one arm wrapped tight around Aria's shoulders while I punched in 911. The operator's voice came through tinny and distant, asking what my emergency was, and I tried to explain, but the words came out wrong, jumbled. "My daughter," I managed to say. "She's been drugged. There was a van, trafficking." The operator told me to stay on the line. Help was coming, and I forced myself to look at the black van still idling 20 feet away with its door hanging open. The license plate? I needed the license plate. I squinted through the dark and repeated the numbers twice to myself, burning them into my brain, while Aria's head lolled against my chest. The bald man was long gone, disappeared into the truck stop or the highway, or wherever monsters go when you pull them into the light. Every instinct screamed at me to chase him down, to make him pay for what he did, but Aria made a small sound, and I knew I couldn't leave her, not even for a second. The operator kept talking, asking me questions I barely heard, and I watched the van's exhaust puffing into the cold night air. Within minutes, I heard sirens and 2 ambulances pulled into the truck stop with lights painting everything red and blue. Paramedics jumped out, and one of them, a woman with her hair pulled back tight, knelt down next to Aria and started checking her pupils with a small flashlight. The light made Arya flinch and whimper, and the paramedic's face got serious real fast. She asked me what Arya had taken, and I told her about the water bottle, how the man had tilted it to Arya's lips, how there were white pills scattered on the van floor. The other paramedic, a younger guy with a neck tattoo, wrapped a silver blanket around Arya's shoulders and helped guide her toward the ambulance. I climbed in beside her, my legs feeling like rubber, and handed the female paramedic my phone with the video still queued up. She watched it while we started moving, her jaw getting tighter with each second, and then she passed the phone to her partner so he could see too. The ambulance smelled like plastic and something sharp, maybe bleach, and Arya kept trying to talk, but her words came out slurred and wrong. I held her hand and told her to save her energy, that we'd figure everything out, but inside my chest felt like it was caving in. A police car followed us to the hospital, and when we pulled up to the ER entrance, an officer got out and asked if he could take my statement right there. The ambulance was still idling, its lights still flashing, and I stood there in the parking lot trying to organize my thoughts into something that made sense. The officer, an older guy with gray at his temples, pulled out a notebook and told me to start from the beginning. I talked too fast, my words running into each other, describing how I followed Arya, how I found her in the van, how every compartment was filled with rope and zip ties, like some kind of kidnapping toolkit. The officer wrote everything down in careful handwriting and then looked up at me with tired eyes. He told me to slow down, to take a breath, and then he asked me to text myself a copy of the video right now to preserve the evidence. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone twice, but I managed to send the video to my own number and show him the confirmation. He nodded and said he'd need the phone eventually, but for now I could keep it, and then he asked me to stay available for more questions. I nodded and rushed back toward the ER entrance where they'd already taken Arya inside. The automatic doors slid open, and I found myself in a waiting room that was too bright, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the smell of hand sanitizer so strong it made my eyes water. Nurses rushed Arya through intake, taking her vitals and asking rapid-fire questions I tried to answer. A doctor appeared, young and serious-looking, and I heard him ordering a toxicology screen and mentioning something about a pregnancy test as standard protocol for assault cases. My stomach dropped, even though I already knew what that test would show, and suddenly, I had to sit down in one of those plastic chairs that are designed to be uncomfortable. I put my head in my hands and tried to breathe while the bright lights made everything feel fake, like this was happening to someone else's family in some other reality. Time moved weird after that, stretching and compressing, and I kept checking my phone even though I had no idea who I was expecting to call. Around 4 a.m., according to the clock on the wall that I'd been staring at, a woman in a dark blazer walked up and introduced herself as Detective Kira Vaughn. She explained she handled trafficking cases and needed to coordinate evidence collection properly, her voice all business without being cold. She sat down across from me and started asking detailed questions about the timeline, writing everything in a small notebook that looked well used. She told me not to delete anything from my phone or Arya's devices, that everything needed to be preserved exactly as it was, and I realized this was way bigger than I'd understood. Detective Vaughn talked about chain of custody procedures and evidence protocols, using terms I'd only heard on TV shows, and the weight of it all pressed down on my shoulders. The sun was just starting to come up, painting the waiting room windows orange, when another woman appeared. She introduced herself as Amy Lane, a CPS social worker, and my chest got tight immediately because I knew what CPS could mean. She must have seen the panic on my face because she sat down next to me, not across, and calmly explained she was here to help, not to take Arya away. Foster parents have specific legal limitations in situations like this, she said, and she needed to clarify what decisions I could make and what required court approval. She asked me questions about how long Arya had been with me, what our relationship was like, whether I'd noticed any warning signs. I answered everything honestly, even though it felt like admitting I'd failed, and Amy wrote notes on a tablet while nodding along. She told me my quick response actually showed I was fit to parent, that I'd done exactly what I should have done, and some of the pressure in my chest eased just slightly. A nurse finally called my name and led me back through a maze of hallways to an exam room where Arya was sitting up in bed looking more alert, but still groggy. Her eyes were red from crying, and she started apologizing the second she saw me, the words tumbling out between hiccups. She told me again about the photos Veronica took, about the threats and blackmail, about how she thought finding another man was her only option when she turned 18. Every word made me want to drive straight to Veronica's apartment and break down the door, but Detective Vaughn's warnings about not interfering with the investigation kept playing in my head. I sat on the edge of Arya's bed and took her hand, telling her none of this was her fault, that we'd figure it out together, but I could see she didn't believe me yet. By mid-morning, a different doctor came in with discharge papers and instructions for follow-up care. He handed me a packet about trauma responses and a safety plan that included keeping Aria home from the school for a few days. Detective Vaughn had already started paperwork for an emergency protective order against both Veronica and the van driver, though she warned it would take a day or two to process. I signed forms without really reading them, my only thought getting Aria somewhere safe, and a nurse brought a wheelchair, even though Aria said she could walk. The ride home was quiet, except for the radio playing low, some talk show I wasn't really listening to, and Aria stared out the window like she was somewhere else entirely. When we pulled into the driveway that afternoon, I helped Aria inside and got her settled on the couch with blankets, and then I went through the house like I was possessed. I changed the deadbolt on the front door, disabled the garage code that Veronica knew, checked every window lock twice. I collected Aria's phone, tablet, and laptop into a plastic bag exactly like Detective Vaughn had instructed, sealing it with tape and writing the date on the outside. Aria watched me from the couch without saying anything, just pulling the blankets tighter around herself, while I transformed our home into something that felt more like a fortress. That evening, after I'd finally convinced Aria to eat some soup, Detective Vaughn called my cell. She reminded me not to contact Veronica under any circumstances, even though she knew I must be mad. I admitted I'd been staring at Veronica's number in my phone for the past hour, imagining what I'd say, all the things I wanted to scream at her. Vaughn's voice got firm then, telling me any contact could mess up the case, that I needed to let the system handle it. I pulled up Veronica's contact on my phone while we were still talking, my finger hovering over the delete button for what felt like forever, and then I pressed it and watched her name disappear from my screen. Late that night, after Aria finally fell asleep in her room, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and started writing down everything I could remember. I put timestamps next to each event, starting from when I heard the front door open at 2 a.m. all the way through the hospital discharge. My handwriting got messy as I wrote faster, trying to capture every detail about the van, the man's appearance, what Aria said about Veronica's threats. I opened my phone and backed up the video to 3 different cloud services, watching the progress bars fill while my leg bounced under the table. I emailed copies to myself at 2 different addresses, then sat there staring at my phone wondering what else I should do. I pulled up Cian's number and texted him asking about ways to preserve digital evidence, keeping the message vague but urgent. His response came back in under a minute offering to help with forensic copying and asking if I needed him to come over right now. I started typing yes, but stopped, remembering Detective Vaughn's warnings about chain of custody and proper procedures. I told Cian I'd check with the detective first and ask what was allowed, then set my phone down and rubbed my eyes. The house was too quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the walls settling. I got up and walked to Aria's door, pressing my ear against it to make sure I could still hear her breathing. I spent most of the night sitting on the floor outside Aria's room with my back against the wall, unable to make myself go to bed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her in that van, sitting there like a doll while that man tilted the water bottle to her lips. My hands would clench into fists, and I'd have to force them open again, stretching my fingers until they hurt. I kept thinking about what I should say to her when she woke up, how to explain that she wasn't just a foster kid to me, that I'd never send her back no matter what. The words felt too big and too small at the same time, like nothing I could say would be enough to undo what Veronica made her believe. Around 3 a.m., I got up and checked all the locks again, testing each window and making sure the new deadbolt was secure. I stood in the living room looking at the couch where Veronica used to sit, where she'd smile at me while planning how to destroy my daughter. The rage came back hot and fast, making my chest tight, but I pushed it down because getting mad wouldn't help Aria sleep safely. I went back to my spot outside her door and listened to her breathe, counting each inhale and exhale like they were proof we'd made it through another hour. The house felt different now, like something had broken that I couldn't see but could feel in every corner. The next morning around 9, Amy showed up at the front door with her tablet and a tired smile that told me she'd been dealing with crisis calls all night. She sat down at the kitchen table across from me and explained in a gentle voice that CPS needed to review what happened since it occurred while Aria was in my care. My whole body went tense, and I felt my jaw clench, all my fear about losing Aria rushing up at once. Amy must have seen it on my face because she held up one hand and quickly said my response was appropriate, that I'd actually done exactly what I should have done. She said my quick action probably prevented something much worse from happening, and some of the pressure in my chest eased just a little bit. She started asking questions about how Veronica got access to Aria, whether I'd noticed any warning signs, how long they'd been alone together. I answered everything as honestly as I could, even though each admission felt like confessing I'd failed as a parent. I told her about the ramen and monster drinks, about how I'd thought Veronica was being helpful when she talked to Arya, about how I'd missed all the signs that should have been obvious. Amy wrote notes on her tablet while nodding, and when I finished, she looked up and said that predators are skilled at hiding their intentions, that I shouldn't blame myself for not seeing something Veronica worked hard to conceal. She asked about our normal routines, about Arya's behavior before all this started, about my plans for keeping her safe going forward. I told her about changing the locks and collecting Arya's devices like Detective Vaughn instructed, and Amy made more notes while saying those were good protective steps. That afternoon, my phone rang with Detective Vaughn's number, and I answered before the second ring finished. She told me the emergency protective order had been filed that morning, and Veronica was served with papers right now. The order prohibited any contact with Arya or me, no calls or texts or social media messages, nothing. Vaughn's voice got more serious as she warned me that Veronica might try reaching out through mutual friends or fake social media accounts, so I should block anyone I didn't personally know. She said predators often test boundaries to see if they can manipulate their way back in. I told her I'd already deleted Veronica's contact info and would watch for anything suspicious. Vaughn said good, then added that violations of the protective order would be documented as additional evidence against Veronica. For the first time since the truck stop, I felt like there was an actual wall between that woman and my daughter, even if it was just a legal document. I thanked Vaughn, and she told me to call immediately if Veronica tried any contact, no matter how small or indirect it seemed. Around noon, I heard movement from Arya's room and knocked softly on her door before opening it. She was sitting up in bed looking more awake than last night, but still pale and tired. I sat on the edge of her bed and asked how she was feeling, and she just shrugged without meeting my eyes. I told her she didn't have to talk about what happened with Veronica, that she could share details when she was ready, or not at all. She nodded and turned toward the wall, pulling her knees up to her chest. I sat there for another minute wanting to say more, wanting to fix everything right now, but I made myself stand up and tell her I'd be right outside if she needed anything. As I walked to the door, she said thanks in a small voice, and I had to swallow hard before I could respond. The truth hit me standing in that doorway, that healing wasn't going to happen on my timeline, no matter how desperately I wanted it to. Arya needed to process everything at her own pace, and my job was to be patient and present, not to push her faster than she could handle. That afternoon, I called my supervisor from the kitchen, pacing back and forth while the phone rang. When he answered, I explained in vague terms that my daughter was dealing with a serious situation and I needed emergency family leave. He asked a few questions about timing, and I told him I needed at least 2 weeks, maybe more depending on how things developed. He approved it immediately, without making me go into details, and I felt grateful for that small mercy. After we hung up, I sat down at the table and looked at my bank account on my phone, doing the math in my head. I'd already used most of my paid time off this year for Arya's school events and a few sick days. 2 weeks unpaid meant missing 2 paychecks, and we were already tight on money most months. The choice between being here for Arya and keeping our bills paid shouldn't exist, but it did, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on my shoulders. I closed the banking app and decided to worry about money later, because right now Arya needed me more than we needed financial security. That evening, the hospital called with results I'd been expecting, but still hit me hard. The nurse on the phone said Arya's pregnancy test came back positive, and they needed to schedule a follow-up appointment. Her voice was professional and kind as she explained the options for prenatal care or pregnancy termination, listing everything in a matter-of-fact tone that somehow made it easier to hear. I grabbed a pen from the counter and wrote down the appointment information on the back of an envelope, my hand shaking enough that the numbers came out wobbly. The nurse asked if I had any questions, and I said no, then thanked her before hanging up. I stood in the kitchen holding that envelope and thinking about how I was going to have this conversation with Arya. The pregnancy wasn't just a medical fact, it was proof of everything Veronica had done to her, and talking about it meant making Arya face that reality head-on. I folded the envelope and put it in my pocket, knowing this was going to be one of the hardest conversations of my life, but also knowing it couldn't wait too long. The next morning, Amy came back with a stack of pamphlets and printed resources about pregnancy options. She spread them out on the kitchen table between us, while explaining that Arya had the legal right to make her own decision about the pregnancy. Amy emphasized multiple times that my role was to support whatever Arya chose, not to influence her decision one way or another. She walked me through the different options: prenatal care if Arya wanted to continue the pregnancy, medication or procedural termination if she didn't, and adoption services if she wanted to carry to term, but not parent. Each option came with its own pamphlet full of information about procedures, timelines, and resources. I listened and nodded, taking in all the details while my stomach twisted itself into knots. Amy asked if I understood that Arya's choice was hers alone, and I said yes out loud, even though inside I was scared of every possible outcome. I told Amy I'd support Arya completely, no matter what she decided, and Amy seemed satisfied with that answer. She left the pamphlets with me and said she'd check back in a few days to see if we had questions. After she left, I sat at the table looking at all those resources, thinking about how each one represented a different future for Arya, and how all of them came from trauma she never should have experienced. Later that morning, Detective Vaughn called with an update about the van. She said the license plate traced back to a shell company registration, which apparently was common in trafficking operations. Her voice sounded frustrated as she explained this meant the investigation would take longer than a simple vehicle owner lookup. She'd have to track down the people behind the shell company, which involved subpoenas and corporate records and a whole chain of legal steps. I could hear her typing in the background while she talked, the clicks coming fast, like she was already working on the next step. I told her I appreciated everything she was doing, and she said this was her job, that she'd handled cases like this before. The way she said it made me feel better, knowing someone this competent was working the case, even if the timeline was stretching out into uncertainty. Vaughn said she'd keep me updated as things developed, and reminded me again not to contact Veronica for any reason. I promised I wouldn't, and we hung up. That afternoon, I drove to the prosecutor's office to meet with Assistant DA Malcolm Buckley. The building was all concrete and glass, with security checkpoints and metal detectors at the entrance. Malcolm met me in a conference room on the third floor, and he was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s with wire-rimmed glasses and a tie that looked expensive. He shook my hand firmly and got straight to business, pulling out a legal pad covered in notes. He explained what evidence they'd need to build a strong case against Veronica and the van driver, talking about testimony requirements and physical evidence and chain of custody. His voice had authority in it, like he'd done this enough times to know exactly what worked and what didn't. I listened carefully as he outlined the challenges of prosecuting trafficking cases, how victims often recanted or refused to testify, how defense attorneys would try to reframe everything as consensual. Malcolm was honest about the fact that many of these cases ended in plea deals rather than trials, and I felt my jaw tighten hearing that. I wanted Veronica to face a jury, wanted her to be convicted on every single charge, but Malcolm said the reality was that plea deals often got faster results and guaranteed convictions. He wasn't making promises he couldn't keep, just laying out the truth of how the system actually worked. I appreciated his honesty, even though I didn't like what I was hearing. Malcolm said the video I'd recorded was strong evidence, and combined with the photos found on Arya's phone and the physical evidence from the van, they had a solid case. He told me to stay patient and let the legal process work, and I promised I would, even though patience had never been my strong point. That same evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at the blank Facebook post box, while trying to figure out how to ask for help without giving away too much. Malcolm's words about community footage kept running through my head, so I typed out a simple request, asking if anyone near the truck stop on Highway 9 had security cameras that might have caught something around 2 a.m. 3 nights ago. I kept it short and didn't mention Arya or trafficking or anything specific, just said I needed footage for a police investigation and left my phone number. Within 2 hours, my phone buzzed with a message from someone named Jerry, who owned the gas station half a mile from the truck stop. He said his camera system recorded the road, and he'd noticed a black van with a big dent in the passenger door driving past around that time. My hands shook as I typed back asking if he could save that footage and if Detective Vaughn could contact him directly. Jerry sent back his business number and said he'd already backed up the files just in case. I immediately texted Vaughn with Jerry's information and felt something close to hope for the first time since the truck stop, like maybe we actually had a chance at building a real case instead of just my word against everyone else's. 3 days later, on the 4th morning after everything happened, Arya came downstairs while I was making coffee and said she'd meet with a therapist, but only if I stayed in the waiting room. I agreed so fast I nearly knocked over my mug, even though part of me wanted to be in that room protecting her from having to say everything out loud again. The therapist's office was in a quiet building downtown with plants in the windows and soft music playing in the lobby. A woman came out to greet us and introduced herself as Bronwyn Flowers, and she had this calm way of moving that made the air feel less heavy. She shook Arya's hand gently and asked her a few basic questions about school and hobbies. Nothing about the trauma yet, just normal getting-to-know-you stuff. Arya's shoulders relaxed a tiny bit as Bronwyn talked, and when they walked back toward the office together, I saw Arya glance back at me once before the door closed. I sat down in the waiting room with a stack of magazines from 2 years ago that I couldn't focus on reading. Every few minutes I'd look up at that closed door and wonder what they were talking about. whether Arya was crying or shutting down or actually opening up. The clock on the wall ticked so slowly I thought it might be broken. After 50 minutes, the door opened, and they came out together. Arya's eyes a little red, but her face calmer than I'd seen it in days. That evening, my phone rang while I was heating up leftover pasta, and Vaughn's name appeared on the screen. She got straight to business and told me Veronica had tried to contact Arya through a brand new Instagram account that afternoon, sending messages that said things like, "I'm worried about you, and please let me explain." Vaughn's voice had this tight quality to it, like she was holding back anger, as she explained they'd already traced the IP address back to Veronica's workplace computer. This violation of the protective order would get added to the growing pile of evidence against her, and Vaughn sounded almost satisfied about that in a grim sort of way. I felt this surge of anger mixed with something like victory, because Veronica was so stupid she thought she could just keep trying to get to Arya even with a court order in place. Vaughn told me to make sure Arya's social media was locked down tight and to screenshot anything suspicious that came through. I promised I would, and hung up, feeling both vindicated that we had more evidence and furious that Veronica wouldn't just stop. Late that night, I was in the kitchen reheating the pasta I'd abandoned earlier when I smelled something sweet and artificial, like fake watermelon. The smell hit me wrong, and I followed it to the fridge where I'd left the door open. That's when I heard Arya crying in her room, this panicked, gasping sound that made my stomach drop. I ran to her door and found her sitting on her bed, hyperventilating, holding an old can of Monster Energy drink she must have found in the back of the fridge. Her whole body was shaking, and she kept saying she was sorry over and over. I grabbed the can from her hands and suddenly understood how deep Veronica's manipulation went, using these specific brands like weapons to make Arya associate them with compliance and control. I went back to the kitchen and started pulling out every energy drink and package of ramen noodles from the cabinets, throwing them all in a trash bag, while Arya watched from the doorway. She didn't say anything, but I could see in her face that she understood why I was doing it, how calculated and deliberate every single thing Veronica did had been. When the bag was full, I tied it up and took it straight to the outside trash bin, then came back and made Arya some tea instead. The next morning, someone knocked on our door around 9, and when I opened it, a man in a suit handed me an envelope and asked me to sign for it. My hands were shaking as I opened the papers and saw they were from Veronica's lawyer, threatening to sue me for defamation if I kept discussing the case publicly. The legal language was full of words like baseless accusations and reputational damage, and I felt my face getting hot as I read through it. The nerve of her trying to intimidate us into silence after everything she'd done made me want to drive to her apartment right then. Instead, I took photos of every page with my phone and sent them to Malcolm with a message asking what this meant. He called back within 40 minutes and told me this was a common scare tactic that defense attorneys used, trying to shut down victims before the case even went to trial. Malcolm's voice was steady and professional as he explained I should ignore the threats completely and definitely not respond to them in any way. He said these kinds of letters rarely led to actual lawsuits because Veronica's lawyer knew the truth would come out in discovery. I felt slightly better after talking to Malcolm, but the papers still sat on my kitchen counter like a poison I couldn't quite throw away. Malcolm spent another 10 minutes on the phone telling me I needed to stay completely off social media and not respond to any questions about the case, no matter how much I wanted to defend Arya publicly. He reminded me that anything I posted could be used against us in court, and that the best thing I could do was stay quiet and let the evidence speak for itself. After we hung up, I opened Facebook and looked at my post about the truck stop footage, seeing all the comments from people asking what happened and offering support. My finger hovered over the delete button for a long time, because part of me wanted everyone to know what Veronica did, wanted her name plastered across every platform so people would know to stay away from her. But I trusted Malcolm's experience more than my own anger, so I deleted the post and resisted the urge to write anything else. The silence felt wrong, like swallowing something sharp, but I knew it was the right choice, even if every instinct in me screamed to expose her. A few days later, Arya went back to see Bronwyn for her second session, and this time when they came out, Arya was holding a small note card in her hand. She showed it to me in the car, and I saw it had phrases written on it like, "I need time to think," and "That doesn't feel right to me." Bronwyn had helped her practice setting boundaries, giving her actual words to use when she felt pressured or uncomfortable. Arya explained that Bronwyn had walked her through identifying specific things Veronica did, like buying her favorite snacks and then using them as rewards, or taking photos and calling them practice shots before taking the real ones. Having names for these tactics seemed to help Arya understand that what happened wasn't her fault, that Veronica had used actual manipulation techniques that had names and patterns. I watched Arya hold that note card like it was something precious, and I realized how much power Veronica had stolen from her just by making her feel like she couldn't say no. The note card was such a small thing, just a few sentences on a piece of paper, but it represented Arya taking back some control over her own voice. During Amy's weekly check-in that Thursday, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and warned me that media attention on the case could trigger a formal placement review. She explained that CPS got put under a microscope whenever foster children were involved in criminal cases, and that reporters sniffing around could cause problems for us even though we hadn't done anything wrong. The fear of losing Arya hit me so hard, I agreed immediately to keep everything as private as possible, promising I wouldn't talk to any media or post anything online about the case. Amy seemed relieved by how quickly I agreed, and made a note in her file that I was putting Arya's stability ahead of my own need to tell our side of the story. She told me the placement review was just a possibility, not a certainty, but that my cooperation now would look good if it came to that. 7 days after the truck stop incident, Vaughn called with actual good news for once. The footage from Jerry's gas station matched the partial plate number I'd given police and showed the same dent in the van's passenger door that I'd described. She'd gone through proper legal channels to get the footage officially, which meant it could be used as evidence in court. Vaughn's voice had this satisfied tone as she explained that the footage strengthened our case significantly because it proved the van existed and was in the area at the time I said it was. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt like the evidence was solid enough that people would have to believe us. It wasn't just my word anymore. Wasn't just Arya's story that could be picked apart by defense lawyers. We had video proof that backed up everything I'd been saying. 2 weeks after finding Arya in that van, Vaughn called again with news that made me sit down hard in my kitchen chair. The forensics team had been going through Arya's confiscated phone and found a hidden cloud album that Arya didn't even know existed. It contained hundreds of photos that Veronica had taken without Arya's knowledge or consent, stored in a secret backup that synced automatically. Vaughn's voice was tight with controlled anger as she explained they were preparing search warrants based on this discovery, that the photos showed a pattern of surveillance and exploitation going back months. I had to put my head between my knees when she told me how many photos there were, my vision going blurry as I tried to process how long Veronica had been planning this. Every photo was another piece of evidence that this wasn't some mistake or misunderstanding, that Veronica had been systematically grooming and documenting my daughter for months while I sat at the same dinner table with her and had no idea what she was doing. The next morning, Detective Vaughn called while I was making breakfast for Arya. She told me the search warrant had been executed at Veronica's apartment overnight, and they'd seized 3 laptops, 2 external hard drives, and a phone I didn't even know she had. My hands started shaking so bad I had to put down the spatula. Vaughn kept talking, her voice steady and professional, explaining they found cloud storage passwords written in a notebook and receipts tucked in a drawer. The receipts were for the exact brands Arya had mentioned, the ramen and Monster Energy drinks, dated from 6 weeks before the truck stop incident. I felt my stomach turn over because these weren't random purchases or things Veronica just happened to have around. She'd bought them on purpose, planned it all out, used them as tools to get close to my daughter. Vaughn said the receipts helped prove intent, showed this was grooming and not some mistake or misunderstanding like Veronica's lawyer would probably claim. After I hung up, I just stood there in the kitchen staring at the eggs burning on the stove. Arya came in and asked if I was okay, but I couldn't find words that made sense. That same afternoon, Vaughn called again to tell me Veronica had hired a lawyer and given a statement to police. The lawyer's version made my blood boil. According to them, Veronica was just helping Arya with legitimate modeling photos, being a mentor, and had no knowledge of any trafficking or illegal activity. Vaughn's voice got tight when she told me this, like she was trying to stay professional, but was just as mad as I felt. She warned me not to let it shake my confidence in the case, said defense lawyers always spin things this way at the start. I spent that whole evening pacing back and forth in the living room while Arya was in her bedroom. Every time I thought about Veronica's lawyer calling those photos legitimate modeling shots, bile rose up in my throat. I kept picturing Veronica sitting in some office with her fancy lawyer, both of them working on a story that made her sound like a helpful girlfriend instead of the predator she actually was. My hands kept clenching into fists, and I had to force myself to breathe slowly. The house felt too small, like the walls were closing in, and I wanted to drive to wherever Veronica was staying and scream at her until my voice gave out. 3 weeks after finding Arya at the truck stop, Malcolm called with news that formal charges had been filed. Veronica was charged with possession and creation of illicit images of a minor, with additional counts still pending as the investigation continued. A bail hearing got scheduled for the following week. Malcolm explained in his calm lawyer voice that Veronica would probably make bail, but there would be strict conditions attached. She wouldn't be allowed near Aria or our house, couldn't leave the county, had to surrender her passport. I felt this weird mix of relief and anger hearing the news. Progress was finally happening. Real legal consequences were starting, but the fact that she might be walking around free in a few days made me want to punch something. Malcolm must have heard it in my voice because he reminded me that bail conditions were better than nothing, that at least there would be monitoring and restrictions. After the call, I sat on the couch and tried to feel good about the charges being filed, but all I could think about was how Veronica should be sitting in a jail cell right now, not preparing for a bail hearing. A few days later, the school counselor called while I was doing laundry. She spoke quietly, like she was worried someone might overhear, and told me there had been a news leak about the case. Students and parents at Aria's high school were asking questions, wanting to know what happened and why Aria hadn't been at the school. The administration couldn't answer because of privacy laws, but the rumors were spreading anyway. The counselor suggested switching Aria to temporary home instruction to protect her from gossip and potential harassment. She said it gently, but I could hear the concern underneath. I agreed immediately without even checking my work schedule first. My boss was already annoyed about all the time I'd taken off, but I didn't care. Aria's emotional safety mattered way more than keeping my job or maintaining some fake normal routine. After I hung up, I went to Aria's room and told her about the home instruction plan. She just nodded and turned back to her homework, but I saw the relief flash across her face. The idea of facing her classmates right now was probably too much to handle on top of everything else. Money started becoming a real problem as my unpaid leave stretched into the 4th week. Medical bills from the hospital were arriving in the mail, each envelope making my chest tight with worry. I'd used up all my paid time off, and my savings account was getting lower every day. One night after Aria went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and started listing stuff on Facebook Marketplace. My guitar went up first, the one I'd played since college, then my camping gear that I'd collected over years of weekend trips. Each item felt like a small piece of my life before all this happened, but they were just things, and Aria was more important. The guitar sold within 2 days to a college student who seemed excited about it. The camping stuff took longer, but eventually someone bought the whole lot. Every sale put a few $100s back in my account, and I told myself it was worth it, that these were sacrifices I could live with. But late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd add up the bills still coming and wonder how long I could keep this going before we were in serious financial trouble. About a week after the protective order was issued, Detective Vaughn called to tell me Veronica had violated it. She'd sent a message through a mutual acquaintance, someone we both knew from the gym, asking if she could explain her side of things. The acquaintance had forwarded the message to me, and I'd immediately sent it to Vaughn. Now there was another charge being added to the growing list against Veronica. Vaughn asked if the acquaintance would be willing to give an interview, and I said I'd ask. When I called him back, he sounded shocked and angry. He told me he'd had no idea what Veronica had done and felt sick that he'd almost helped her contact us. He agreed to talk to Detective Vaughn, and during his interview, he apparently shared a bunch of context about conversations he'd had with Veronica over the past few months. She'd asked him questions about Aria, about what teenage girls were into these days, about how to connect with a younger person. At the time, he'd thought she was just trying to be a good girlfriend and bond with my daughter. Now he realized how calculated every question had been. Hearing this from Vaughn made me feel a little less crazy, like other people were finally seeing through Veronica's act, but I was also furious that she'd tried to reach us even after everything. One quiet afternoon when Aria was feeling a bit better, she came into the living room carrying the bag she'd had with her at the truck stop. She pulled out a crumpled receipt and handed it to me without saying anything at first. It was from an expedited passport service, dated 2 weeks before that night, showing a payment of exactly $500. Her voice came out flat and emotionless when she finally explained that Veronica had told her she'd need a passport for international modeling opportunities. Aria said she'd believed it because she wanted so badly to have value, to be worth something to someone. The guilt hit me like a truck when I realized this was the warning sign I'd completely missed. The $500 theft that started everything, and I'd been so focused on being mad about the stealing that I never asked why she needed a passport so urgently. I wanted to apologize, to take back my anger from that first conversation with the police, but instead, I just thanked her for trusting me enough to show me the receipt now. She nodded and went back to her room, leaving me sitting there with that piece of paper in my hands, feeling like the worst parent in the world. After getting permission from Detective Vaughn, I finally asked Cian to help with the investigation. He'd been offering since the beginning, but I'd held off because Vaughn wanted to make sure everything stayed legal and proper. Cian spent 2 days digging into the passport service's business records and came back with information that made my skin crawl. The service was registered to a shell entity, some fake company with no real address, and that same shell entity had connections to the van's registration. He put together a whole document showing the links and shared it with Vaughn, who actually sounded impressed when she called me back. She said Cian's findings were getting added to the investigation file and helped connect dots they'd been struggling with. Having Cian's help felt like having backup for the first time, like I wasn't fighting this battle completely alone. He was outraged on Arya's behalf in a way that matched my own anger, but he channeled it into something useful, instead of just raging like I'd been doing. Every piece of evidence he found felt like another brick in the wall we were building around Veronica. During one of our joint therapy sessions, Bronwyn pulled me aside before Arya came in and taught me something called co-regulation techniques. She explained that when Arya had panic attacks, my instinct to fix everything immediately was actually making things worse. Instead, I needed to stay calm myself and just be present with her. Bronwyn showed me breathing exercises and how to ground myself first before trying to help Arya. She said kids mirror the emotional state of their parents, so if I was freaking out, Arya would freak out more. It sounded simple but felt impossible when I thought about actually doing it during a real crisis. The next time Arya started spiraling at home, crying and hyperventilating over something that reminded her of Veronica, I forced myself to sit down nearby and do the breathing exercises. I didn't try to hug her or tell her it would be okay or ask a million questions. I just breathed slowly and stayed there. After a few minutes, she looked over at me and started matching my breathing pattern. She didn't lock herself in the bathroom like usual. She let me sit there with her until the panic passed. It was such a tiny victory, but it felt huge, like we were finally rebuilding trust one breath at a time. 5 weeks after everything started, I sat down with Amy during her weekly check-in and told her I wanted to adopt Arya officially. I wanted our relationship to be legally permanent, not just foster care that could end when she turned 18. Amy's face softened when I said it, like she'd been hoping I'd bring this up. She pulled out a folder and started explaining the process. There would be a home study, even though I'd already passed one to become a foster parent. They'd review my finances again, do more background checks, interview people who knew us, and most importantly, Arya would have to consent. She'd have to stand in front of a judge and say she wanted me to be her legal father permanently. Amy went through each requirement slowly, making sure I understood how long and complicated the path forward would be. With every item she listed, my resolve got stronger instead of weaker. All the paperwork and interviews and waiting periods didn't matter because Arya deserved to know she was permanently mine. She needed to stop worrying about being sent back to foster care or aging out of the system. I wanted to give her that security, that proof that family wasn't about biology or temporary placements, but about choosing each other. When Amy finished explaining everything, I told her to start the paperwork immediately. She smiled and made a note in her file, then reminded me that we still had to ask Arya if this was what she wanted too. A few days later, Malcolm called me into his office for a case update, and the news wasn't what I wanted to hear. He sat across from me with a stack of files and explained that the legal process would likely take months, maybe ending in a plea deal, instead of the full trial I'd been imagining. I felt my jaw tighten as he talked about court backlogs and how the prosecutor's office had limited resources to take every case to trial. Malcolm's voice stayed calm and professional while he walked me through the reality of how these things actually work, not how I wished they would work. He said justice might not look exactly like what I pictured in my head, but it was still justice if Veronica faced real consequences and got put on a registry. I wanted to argue, to demand the maximum sentence and a public trial where everyone would know what she did, but Malcolm's straightforward explanation helped me understand that wasn't realistic. The system moved slow and made compromises, and I had to accept that, or drive myself crazy, fighting against how things actually worked. By the time I left his office, I felt less angry and more resigned, which wasn't satisfaction, but at least it was something I could live with. Detective Vaughn called me the next morning with news about the bald van driver, her voice carrying that professional tone that meant she had information. She'd identified him through prior arrest records, a guy named Dennis Kowalski, who had a pattern of trafficking charges that never stuck because victims kept recanting their statements. Vaughn explained how victim intimidation worked in these cases, how traffickers threatened and manipulated people into changing their stories or just disappearing before trial. She walked me through why trafficking prosecutions were so hard to win, listing all the ways the system failed repeatedly to protect vulnerable people. My anger started shifting as she talked, moving from just hating Dennis and Veronica to hating the whole broken system that let them operate for years. But I was grateful Vaughn was one of the people actually trying to fix those failures, someone who cared enough to keep building cases even when they were hard to win. She told me Dennis had victims going back at least 5 years, all young girls who got scared into silence. The thought of how many kids he'd hurt made me sick, but at least now we had a chance to stop him for real. 6 weeks after the truck stop incident, Bronwyn brought up an idea during one of our therapy sessions that made my stomach drop. She proposed having Aria participate in a controlled call to Veronica, something that would be recorded and supervised by Detective Vaughn to potentially capture admissions. Bronwyn had already done extensive therapy prep with Aria about this possibility, making sure she understood it could help the case, but might also be hard to go through. Aria had consented to try it, which surprised me, because I didn't think she'd want to hear Veronica's voice again. Bronwyn explained that Aria was growing in her ability to advocate for herself and set boundaries, and this could be a way for her to reclaim some power. I was terrified of putting Aria through more pain, of having her relive the manipulation and lies, but I trusted Bronwyn's judgment about what Aria could handle. Aria had been working on scripts in therapy, practicing what to say and how to stay calm if Veronica tried to twist things around. The thought of my daughter having to talk to that woman again made my hands shake with rage, but if it helped the case, and if Aria felt ready, I wouldn't stand in her way. The controlled call happened 2 days later in Detective Vaughn's office, a small room with recording equipment set up and Bronwyn sitting right next to Aria. I watched through the observation window, my hands pressed flat against the glass as Aria dialed Veronica's number with shaking fingers. When Veronica answered, her voice came through the speakers sounding fake and sweet, asking how Aria was doing like they were still friends. Aria followed the script perfectly, asking questions about the modeling photos and the men Veronica introduced her to. Veronica made coded admissions about helping with opportunities and how certain clients preferred girls in specific situations. My hands clenched into fists when Veronica said pregnancy makes girls more valuable to certain clients, her voice casual like she was discussing the weather. Aria's voice stayed steady through the whole call, not breaking even when Veronica tried to make it sound like everything was Aria's idea. When it was over, Aria hung up and immediately started shaking, her whole body trembling as Bronwyn wrapped an arm around her shoulders. But I could see something else in Aria's face too, a kind of pride that she'd confronted Veronica on her own terms and stayed strong. She looked up at the observation window where I was standing and gave me a small nod, and I knew she understood she'd just reclaimed some of the power Veronica had stolen from her. Malcolm called me that evening after reviewing the recording, and his voice carried a mix of satisfaction and frustration. Veronica's defense attorney was already trying to frame the recorded call as legitimate modeling industry discussion, spinning the coded language as normal business talk. But Malcolm was adding coercion and enticement charges based on the clear context of what Veronica actually meant. He walked me through how the legal maneuvering worked, each side trying to reinterpret the same evidence to support their version of events. It felt like a chess game where I couldn't see all the pieces. Moments of progress followed immediately by defense spin that made me want to flip a table. Malcolm warned me this back and forth would continue for weeks, each side filing motions and counter-motions, and I needed to prepare myself for the frustration. I experienced whiplash listening to him describe how the defense would argue and how he'd counter, the constant push and pull of building a case. 7 weeks after everything started, Aria began experiencing severe morning sickness that left her unable to keep food down for days. She'd run to the bathroom every morning and sometimes in the middle of the night, her face pale and sweaty when she finally came out. I scheduled a prenatal consultation at a clinic Bronwyn recommended, a place that specialized in helping young patients understand their options. The doctor who saw us was calm and kind, speaking directly to Aria while including me as support, but making it clear this was Aria's decision. She explained all the options available, including the timeframes for different procedures, using simple language that didn't make Aria feel judged. The doctor outlined continuing the pregnancy versus medication or procedural termination, giving Aria printed information to take home and think about. My role was to facilitate whatever Aria chose, not to push her in any direction, and the doctor emphasized that multiple times. I sat there feeling helpless, but trying to stay calm and supportive, knowing this choice would affect Aria's whole future. The ultrasound happened during that same appointment, the doctor moving the wand across Aria's stomach while images appeared on the screen. She dated the pregnancy and provided clinical details that made everything feel more real and immediate than it had before. Afterward, the doctor privately outlined the care pathway for continuing the pregnancy versus the windows for medication or procedural termination, giving us specific timeframes and next steps. Aria asked questions I wouldn't have thought of, specific things about recovery time and side effects, and what each option actually involved. Her maturity in handling this conversation broke my heart, even as I felt proud of her thoughtfulness. She wasn't rushing into a decision or letting anyone else make it for her, just carefully considering what was right for her situation. The doctor gave us her direct number and told Aria to call anytime she had more questions or was ready to move forward with whatever she decided. We worked with the school counselor the following week to create a re-entry plan for Aria, sitting in her office while she pulled up a modified schedule on her computer. The counselor had clearly dealt with students affected by trauma before, building in practical accommodations without making Aria feel singled out or different. Aria would have permission to leave class if she felt overwhelmed, a designated safe person she could check in with, and reduced homework load for the first month back. The counselor explained each accommodation carefully, making sure Aria understood she could use them without explaining why to her teachers. It felt like a vulnerable step forward, returning to normal routines while nothing actually felt normal yet. Aria nodded along as the counselor talked, asking a few questions about how the check-ins would work and whether she could eat lunch in the counselor's office if the cafeteria felt like too much. The counselor agreed to everything, writing it all down in Aria's plan and giving us both copies to keep at home. On Aria's second day back at the school, my phone rang during my lunch break with the school counselor's number on the screen. A staff member had reported seeing the van driver loitering near the parking lot, and the school resource officer was responding to the situation right now. I was in my car heading to the school before the SRO even finished telling me they'd engaged the suspect, my heart pounding as I drove faster than I should have. The adrenaline spike reminded me that safety was fragile and constant vigilance was exhausting, but necessary. By the time I got there, the SRO had Dennis in custody, and Aria was safe in the counselor's office. But the damage was done. Aria's face was white, and she wouldn't stop shaking. The brief returned to normal completely shattered by seeing him near her school. I held her while she cried, and the SRO took my statement about the protective order and the ongoing case. Detective Vaughn petitioned for Dennis's detention based on the school incident, arguing that he'd violated the terms of his release by approaching a victim. But the judge granted supervised release instead of jail time, adding an ankle monitor and stricter check-in requirements, but letting him stay out. The decision felt like a betrayal of common sense, and I sat in the courthouse gallery with my hands gripping the bench in front of me to keep from yelling. Malcolm met me outside afterward and explained the frustrating reality of overcrowded jails and judges who didn't treat intimidation seriously enough. He walked me through how supervised release was still a restriction, still consequences, even though it wasn't what we wanted. I left the courthouse feeling bitter about imperfect justice, but trying to focus on the fact that Dennis would be monitored and tracked, that the system was at least doing something even if it wasn't enough. Outside the courthouse, my hands were shaking, so bad I could barely grip my keys. The defense attorney was standing near his car, talking on his phone, and something in me just snapped. I walked over and started yelling about how he was defending a monster who drugged kids and how supervised release was a joke. My voice got louder with each word, and people in the parking lot turned to stare. The attorney just looked at me with this calm expression that made me even more mad and told me I was out of line. A bailiff came running out of the building and grabbed my arm, telling me I needed to leave right now or I'd be cited for contempt. The walk back to my car with everyone watching felt like the longest walk of my life. My face burned with shame, even though I was still furious about the whole situation. I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes just breathing and trying to calm down before I could actually drive home. That evening I called Malcolm to apologize, and he answered on the first ring. I admitted I lost control and asked if I'd damaged the case in any way. Malcolm was quiet for a second, and then told me he understood my anger, but I couldn't let emotion override strategy again. He said the judge already made his decision, so my outburst didn't change anything legally, but I needed to stay calm going forward. His tone was firm, but not mean, and I appreciated that he didn't lecture me like I was a kid. I promised him I'd keep it together from now on, even though I wasn't sure I could actually do that. That night after Aria went to bed, I knocked on her door and asked if we could talk. She was sitting on her bed with her phone and looked up at me with this guarded expression. I sat down on the edge of her bed and told her I was sorry for losing control at the courthouse today. I explained that my anger sometimes gets the better of me, even when I'm trying to model better behavior for her. Aria put her phone down and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. She said she accepted my apology, but she needed me to stay calm because my anger scared her sometimes, even when it wasn't aimed at her. The words hit me harder than any punch could have, and I felt my throat get tight. I told her she was right and that I'd work on it. She nodded, but then added that she needed to be able to trust that I wouldn't explode when things got hard. Her setting this boundary was exactly what Bronwyn had been teaching her in therapy, and I felt proud of her, even as I felt ashamed of myself. I squeezed her hand and promised I'd do better, and she squeezed back before picking up her phone again. The next week, Bronwyn suggested we create a written safety and communication plan during one of our joint sessions. She pulled out a template she'd used with other families, and we spent an hour filling it out together. The document outlined how we'd handle triggers like certain smells or sounds that reminded Aria of what happened. It included scripts for what Arya could say when she felt overwhelmed and what I should do in response. We wrote down specific steps for disagreements so neither of us would feel attacked or dismissed. Bronwyn had us both sign it at the bottom like it was an official contract, and she made copies for each of us. The whole thing felt formal and a bit weird, but I understood why it mattered. Having clear expectations written down actually made my chest feel less tight because I knew exactly what Arya needed from me. Arya folded her copy carefully and put it in her backpack, and I noticed over the next few days that she'd pull it out and look at it when she needed to assert a boundary. One morning, she showed me the paper and pointed to the section about needing advance notice before people came over, and I immediately agreed. The plan was working. 10 weeks after the truck stop, I walked into the county office and filed the adoption petition. The woman at the desk gave me a stack of forms and told me a social worker would be assigned to do a home study. 2 days later, a woman called and introduced herself as my evaluator and scheduled the first visit. She showed up with a clipboard and spent 3 hours asking me questions about everything. She wanted to know about my finances and how much money I made and whether I had savings. She asked about my discipline approach and how I handled Arya's bad behavior. She asked who my support system was and whether I had family nearby who could help. She asked detailed questions about how I planned to address Arya's ongoing issues from the trafficking. I answered everything as honestly as I could, even when it made me look bad. I told her about my money problems and selling my stuff to pay bills. I admitted I'd lost my temper at the courthouse and was working on controlling my anger better. I explained that I didn't have much family support, but I had Bronwyn and Malcolm and Detective Vaughn helping us. The evaluator wrote everything down without showing any reaction on her face. When she finally left, I felt like I'd been through an exam and had no idea if I'd passed or failed. A few days later, Malcolm called with news about the case. The prosecution was offering Veronica a plea deal where she'd give them passwords to more cloud accounts and testify about the bigger trafficking network. In exchange, some of her charges would get dropped and she'd get a lighter sentence recommendation. I felt my jaw clench when Malcolm explained this, and I asked why they'd give her any kind of deal. Malcolm said the information could help them find other victims and stop more trafficking from happening. He explained that sometimes you have to accept smaller wins to get bigger ones, and that Veronica's testimony could take down multiple people. I understood his logic, but it still felt wrong to give her anything after what she did to Arya. The idea of her getting less time in prison because she cooperated made my stomach turn. Malcolm seemed to sense my frustration and reminded me that she'd still go to prison and have to register as an offender for life. I said okay, because I trusted his judgment, but the moral discomfort of the whole thing sat heavy in my chest for days afterward. The passwords Veronica handed over opened up a whole other level of evidence. Detective Vaughn called to tell me they'd found accounts with information about multiple victims and several other people involved in the network. She explained that this meant Arya wouldn't have to carry the entire case on her testimony, which would make things way less stressful for her. I felt relief hearing that, even though I was still mad about the plea deal. Vaughn walked me through what they'd discovered, including messages between Veronica and other people about recruiting girls. She said the evidence was solid enough that they could build cases against at least 4 other people. I asked if that meant Arya was completely safe now, and Vaughn was honest that there was no such thing as completely safe, but this definitely helped. The fact that something good could come from Veronica's cooperation didn't erase what she'd done, but it did make the compromise feel slightly less terrible. I thanked Vaughn for the update, and she told me she'd keep me informed as things developed. 12 weeks after everything started, Veronica stood in court and pleaded guilty to multiple counts. I sat in the gallery with my hands gripping the bench in front of me, watching her lawyer read the plea agreement. Some charges got dropped entirely, and others got reduced in exchange for her cooperation and testimony. The judge accepted the plea and set a sentencing date for 2 months out. Malcolm had warned me the sentence probably wouldn't be as long as I wanted, and he was right. The recommendation included prison time, but also mentioned her cooperation as a reason for leniency. I watched Veronica's face the whole time, and she looked calm and composed, like this was just another business transaction. The bailiff led her out in handcuffs, and I felt a weird mix of satisfaction and disappointment. She was being held responsible, but not to the extent I thought she deserved. Malcolm met me outside and reminded me that she'd still serve time and be on the registry forever, which would follow her for life. I nodded because I knew he was right, but it didn't stop me from wishing the consequences were bigger. A week after Veronica's plea, the federal prosecutor held a press conference announcing an indictment against the van driver. The charges were federal trafficking counts that carried way longer sentences than the state charges. Malcolm called to tell me about it and explained that federal cases moved slower but had more resources and harsher punishments. The van driver, whose name I learned was Dennis, was still on monitored release with the ankle bracelet until his trial. Knowing he was out there somewhere even with restrictions made it hard to feel totally safe. I asked Malcolm when the trial would be, and he said probably 6 to 8 months, which felt like forever. The idea of living with that constant low-level worry for months was exhausting, but at least the system was finally treating him like the serious threat he was. Malcolm assured me the federal case was strong, and Dennis would likely end up in prison for a long time. I appreciated the reassurance, even though I knew nothing was guaranteed until a jury came back with a verdict. After weeks of counseling sessions, Aria told Bronwyn she wanted to end the pregnancy. Bronwyn called me separately to discuss it and make sure I understood my role as Aria's legal guardian. I told her I'd provide consent without any hesitation or judgment, because this was Aria's choice to make. Bronwyn scheduled another session, where the three of us talked through what the procedure would involve and what the recovery would look like. Aria asked specific questions about pain and how long she'd need to stay home from the school. I sat there listening and taking mental notes about what I'd need to buy and how I'd need to rearrange my schedule. The choice was painful for both of us in different ways, but I was certain that Aria making this decision herself was important for her healing. Bronwyn helped Aria work through the complicated emotions of grief, mixed with relief, and I just tried to be supportive without pushing my own feelings onto her. We scheduled the appointment for the following week at a private clinic that Bronwyn recommended. The morning of the procedure, I drove Aria to the clinic and walked her inside where Bronwyn was already waiting. I stayed in the waiting room while they took Aria back, and Bronwyn went with her. I picked up a magazine and stared at the same page about home renovations for what felt like hours. My leg bounced up and down, and I kept checking my phone even though I knew they'd come get me when it was done. Other people came and went from the waiting room, and I tried not to make eye contact with anyone. Finally, a nurse came out and told me Aria was in recovery and doing fine. They brought me back to sit with her, and she looked pale but calm. Bronwyn had her hand and was talking to her quietly. We drove home carefully with me, avoiding every pothole and bump in the road. For the next few days, I managed everything Bronwyn had told me about, including pain medication every 6 hours, heating pads when she had cramps, and her favorite comfort foods. Bronwyn increased their therapy sessions to twice a week to help Aria process everything. The grief mixed with relief was complicated and messy, and I didn't try to make it simpler with empty words about it being for the best. I just stayed present and made sure Aria knew I was there for whatever she needed. Over the next 2 weeks, CPS conducted their review of the medical consent and everything that happened around Aria's procedure. They interviewed Aria twice at our house, sitting at the kitchen table with their notebooks, while I waited in the living room. They interviewed Bronwyn at her office and got records from the clinic showing every conversation we had about options and consent. I checked my phone constantly, waiting for news about whether they'd question my judgment or try to remove Aria. Every time I saw Amy's name pop up on my caller ID, my stomach dropped. Finally, she called on a Tuesday afternoon and told me they found my actions completely proper and there would be no placement change. The way my whole body relaxed when she said those words felt like I'd been holding my breath for 3 months straight. All that fear about losing Aria to some bureaucratic second-guessing just evaporated, and I had to sit down on the couch because my legs went weak with relief. When Aria went back to the school the following Monday, the rumors had already started spreading, despite everything we did to keep things private. I dropped her off at the front entrance and watched her walk inside with her backpack, and by lunchtime the school counselor was calling to tell me some students were avoiding Aria, while others kept asking invasive questions. The counselor said she was working on managing the gossip and making sure Aria had a safe space to go if things got overwhelming. Over the next few days, Aria's social circle shifted in ways that hurt to watch. Kids she used to sit with at lunch suddenly had full tables when she approached. Girls she thought were friends whispered when she walked past in the hallway, but one girl named Sophie stuck by her through everything, sitting with Aria at lunch and walking with her between classes and shutting down the gossip when she heard it. That one friend's loyalty gave Aria something solid to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain and lonely. I'd see them together after school sometimes and feel grateful that Aria had at least one person who saw past the rumors to the real person underneath. The home study process for the adoption started right around the same time, and it felt like every part of our life got put under a microscope. The evaluator came to our house 3 separate times looking at financial records, safety measures, daily routines, therapy attendance logs, emergency plans, and household rules. She walked through every room checking smoke detectors and asking questions about discipline approaches and support systems. She noted corrections needed on her clipboard during the second visit, pointing out that my documentation of Aria's therapy attendance wasn't detailed enough, and my emergency plan didn't include enough backup contacts. She said my household rules needed to be clearer and written down somewhere visible. I made every single change she requested within 24 hours, printing out new documents and buying a whiteboard for the kitchen where I wrote out clear expectations about chores and curfews and communication. The scrutiny felt invasive sometimes, like having someone judge whether you're good enough to keep your own kid, but I took pride in demonstrating competence even when it was uncomfortable. Every correction I made felt like proof that I was willing to do whatever it took to make this adoption happen. 4 months after the truck stop, Veronica's sentencing hearing finally arrived on a cold Thursday morning. I sat in the courtroom gallery in the back row, my hands gripping the wooden bench in front of me, while the judge reviewed the plea agreement and sentencing recommendations. Malcolm sat at the prosecution table with his files spread out, and Veronica sat next to her defense attorney wearing a gray suit that made her look professional and harmless. The defense attorney stood up and gave a speech painting Veronica as a victim of circumstance who made poor choices but deserved leniency because she cooperated with the investigation. I had to bite down on my tongue to keep from speaking out when he talked about her difficult childhood and how she was manipulated by others in the trafficking network. The judge listened to both sides and then imposed 3 years in prison, plus sex offender registration requirements and supervised release conditions. Watching the consequences finally land on Veronica provided some sense that accountability was enforced, even though the sentence felt too short for what she did. She didn't look at me once during the whole hearing, just stared straight ahead with no expression on her face when the judge announced the sentence. After the sentencing, Malcolm arranged for Aria to give a victim impact statement via video, since she didn't want to be in the same room as Veronica. We recorded it at Bronwyn's office with Bronwyn sitting just off camera for support. Aria's voice stayed steady as she explained how Veronica's betrayal affected her sense of safety and self-worth, talking about the nightmares that woke her up at 3 in the morning and the anxiety that made it hard to trust anyone new. She didn't cry or perform emotion for the camera, just stated facts about what it felt like to have someone she trusted use that trust to hurt her. She talked about broken trust and feeling dirty and wondering if she'd ever feel normal again. When the recording was done, Aria told Bronwyn and me that speaking her truth felt powerful, that putting words to what happened made it feel less like something shameful she had to hide. I could see the fragile strength she was building word by word, taking back pieces of herself that Veronica tried to steal. 5 months after everything began, we got the call from Amy that we'd received preliminary adoption approval. The final adoption would be scheduled after a review period to make sure everything stayed stable, but the hard part was basically done. Amy congratulated us over the phone and said something that stuck with me, that our handling of the crisis actually demonstrated strong parent-child bonding instead of being a mark against us. Aria and I celebrated quietly at home that evening, ordering pizza and watching a movie on the couch. We both understood that legal permanence wouldn't erase the trauma or make the nightmares stop, but it provided the security Aria always needed. The knowledge that no one could take her away from me now, that she was legally and permanently my daughter, settled something deep in both of us that had been unsettled since the day we met. That same week, I made the decision to pause any thoughts of dating for the foreseeable future. Aria and I sat down at the kitchen table together one Saturday afternoon and drafted house rules for if and when I eventually pursued relationships again. She wrote down what she wanted in her notebook first, then read the list out loud. She wanted veto power over anyone entering our home, mandatory background checks before I even went on a first date, and a slow introduction process that would take months before anyone met her. I agreed to every single term without hesitation, writing them down on the whiteboard next to our household rules. I recognized that her trust had to be earned back in this area, and that her safety mattered more than my social life or any future relationship. Watching her advocate for herself and set clear boundaries felt like proof that therapy was working, that she was learning to protect herself in ways she couldn't before. On a quiet Sunday evening 5 months after the truck stop, we decided to cook real ramen together, the good kind from the Asian market with fresh noodles and actual broth packets, not the instant packets that Veronica weaponized during her grooming. We went through the pantry and tossed out all the energy drinks we'd bought before everything happened, throwing the cans in the trash one by one. The artificial watermelon smell that used to trigger Aria's panic attacks would never be in our house again. After dinner, we sat on the porch with mugs of hot tea, the evening air cool enough that we needed blankets. Aria pulled out a notebook, and we started writing a plan for the next year together, listing therapy goals and school milestones, and the adoption finalization date. We wrote down what we wanted to accomplish, and how we'd handle setbacks, and what our new normal would look like. The peace we felt sitting there wasn't the kind of peace where everything was fixed or perfect. It was measured and hard-won, built on honest communication, and the knowledge that we were choosing each other permanently. Not because the system assigned us, or because we had to, but because we both wanted this family we were creating together.